Today on Sports Science Shorts from the Perception in Action podcast. You can't play sports, you're just a girl. Understanding the effects of stereotype threat on performance. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to consider the fascinating topic of stereotype threat and skilled performance, considering some of the seminal studies in this area and looking at some very recent ones that show a reversal of the effects. The term stereotype threat was first coined by Steele and Aronson in 1995, and it refers to the concern or worrying thoughts that arise when one feels at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about one's social group. The typical example used is the performance of women in mathematics. Specifically, if women are told that females typically score lower than men on math tests, they usually end up doing so, even in cases where they're more well-trained and better prepared. This is obviously an important issue to understand because it can be related to an important problem in society, the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. For highly cognitive tasks like doing math problems, the primary theory of why this occurs is similar to the distraction theory of performance pressure I talked about way back in episode 11. Namely, stereotype threat serves to create worrying thoughts. For example, I'm just going to be another confirmation of the stereotype that women are bad at math, which take up some of the test takers' memory and attentional resources. So, for example, they may not read the question as carefully due to this distraction. In today's episode, I want to focus on less purely cognitive skills like math and more on perceptual motor skills like those involved in sports. Of course, similar to my math example, I think most people could easily think of examples of stereotype threat in sports. A common one here in the USA is women's basketball. Women often hear things like, "Nobody cares about the WNBA. You're too slow, can't dunk, and would get destroyed if you played on the same court as men." Again, the effects of stereotype threat in this context can be linked to important societal problems. Namely, that women tend to show lower levels of daily physical activity and less participation in competitive sports. Before I dig into the research on this topic, I wanted to mention a brief aside. I think the effects of stereotype threat are similar in a lot of ways to the effects a team's history can have on performance. As an example, I was watching a college football game this weekend between Florida and Kentucky. Florida has beat its division rival 31 straight times, with its last loss to Kentucky coming in 1987. Another example is England's soccer team's performance in penalty shootouts. Even though these records were set by players that are not on the team anymore, and the players and coaches always say the weight of history doesn't matter at all, I think worrying thoughts about adding to these records do creep in high-pressure situations. I'll be considering this more in a future episode. But anyways, let's get back to the issue of stereotype threat. Does it really affect sports performance? And if so, why?
Tell your girls a story, I won't tell you a lie. Anything you want, you can do it just fine. Come on. Come on and rock the world. If they tell you you can't do it, you just turn it up and play like a girl.
The first paper I ever read on this topic was done by Sion Bylock and colleagues in 2006. Up to this point in the episode, I've been talking about the problem with stereotype threat being that it distracts a performer with worrying thoughts about confirming the stereotype. Well, as I discussed back in episode 11, the bulk of evidence suggests that distraction does not hurt performance in highly automatic perceptual motor skills like those involved in high-level sports. The best evidence for this being that experts can handle doing a variety of different secondary tasks while performing their sport. This was the exact issue explored by Sion and her colleagues. The paper is also interesting because it used men as the target of the threat instead of women. Although most studies of stereotype threat are on women, it can also occur in men as well. In this study, a group of expert male golfers, with an average handicap less than 8, were told that women actually tend to perform better than men on the putting task, and that a recent examination of PGA and LPGA playing statistics demonstrates that women tend to have a better short game as compared to men. In a first experiment, players in the stereotype threat group increased the distance they left the ball from the hole by about 3 centimeters after they received the threat, while there was no change in performance for a control group. To test the potential role of distraction, in a second experiment, Sion had golfers putt in both a single task condition, i.e. just putting, and a dual task condition in which they had to listen to a stream of words for a target word. Again, expert golfers were used. Consistent with the previous research, the control group performed equally well in both of these single task and dual task conditions. The experimental group, on the other hand, showed a reduction in putting accuracy when given the stereotype threat in the single task condition, but no effect of the threat when given it in the dual task condition. This provides evidence that stereotype threat hurts performance by causing explicit monitoring, not distraction. When you give a performer a dual task, which is a type of distraction, it prevents them from turning their attention inwards in response to the stereotype threat. Similar effects to Sion's golf study have also been shown in other sports. For example, in a soccer study by Herman and Vollmeyer earlier this year, female participants were asked to dribble a soccer ball through a course twice. Between the two attempts, half of the participants read a fictitious article about the incompetence of female soccer players, while a control group read an article about the rise of popularity of soccer. Participants in the stereotype threat group took about 1 second longer to complete the course on average, the second time, while players in the control group actually got a bit faster. These performance effects were not mediated by the level of worry reported by the participants, again supporting the idea it is explicit monitoring rather than distraction that is causing the effect. Similar effects of stereotype threat have also been reported for simulated driving, tennis serving, and basketball free throw shooting. So it seems like a pretty straightforward story.
1, 2, 3, 4. So typical. Stereotypical. So typical. You're stereotypical.
Well, more recently, Megan Huber and colleagues from Northeastern University have added a few new interesting twists to this topic. In these experiments, a ball bouncing task developed by Dagmar Sternad was used. This task involves using a real table tennis racket to repeatedly bounce a virtual ball upwards so that it goes to a particular target height. The advantage of using this task is that it can be precisely modeled, and the performance errors can be understood at a very high level of detail. For example, from the modeling, it was determined that the most stable and effective control strategy in this task is to hit the ball during the negative acceleration of the racket's movements. In other words, when it's slowing down. This strategy automatically will correct for any errors in the timing at the point of contact. For example, if you hit the ball a little too soon, the ball will be hit with a higher velocity, so that if you do nothing next time, your timing will be a little later. In other words, closer to being accurate. Similarly, if you hit the ball a little too late, the velocity on the next bounce will be slower, making you contact the ball a bit earlier next time. Not surprisingly, this is a strategy that must be learned, with novices tending to hit the ball during the positive acceleration phase of the racket swing, then switching to the negative phase after practice. What does all this have to do with stereotype threat? In a first study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance earlier this year, Huber and colleagues compare the effects of threat on female performers at 2 skill levels in the ball bouncing task: novices and experienced participants that had practiced the task before. The stereotype threat involved telling participants that men typically perform better on the task than women. What was found? Consistent with previous research, for the novice group, the threat hurt performance. Specifically, participants in the Stereotype Threat group had larger height errors and more often hit the ball with positive acceleration, which remember is a bad strategy, as compared to both a female control group and males that were told men perform better than women. Now the really interesting part. For the experienced participants, the Stereotype Threat had the exact opposite effect. That is, it improved performance. As compared to a control group, female participants that received the threat instructions actually had smaller errors and produced racket strokes with even a greater negative acceleration, the good strategy. Why might this be the case? Huber and colleagues propose that it supports a mere effort theory of stereotype threat. That is, when threatened, a performer is motivated to do well, leading them to execute the prepotent action, or in other words, the one that they are most likely to produce. For novices, the prepotent response is hitting the ball with a positive acceleration, which makes them get even worse. While for individuals that are experienced at the task, the prepotent response is to hit the ball with negative acceleration, so the threat makes them get even better. In a follow-up study recently published in Acta Psychologica, Huber and colleagues showed that this facilitation of performance by stereotype threat can actually also occur in novices if the task is chosen correctly. For this, they modified the ball bouncing task so that instead of producing a rhythmic behavior, that is bouncing the ball over and over, the task was discrete. That is, participants just had to hit the ball once to a certain target height. The key here is that the discrete version of the task requires essentially no learning. Novices can center the ball around the target height with very little error right from the start of training. So in other words, the prepotent response of novices is an effective one in this task. What happens when the threat that men perform better than women is introduced? Amazingly, performance is improved. As compared to a control group that did not receive the threat, female participants in the stereotype threat condition had a lower variability, that is, better precision, in this task. So, in a nutshell, it seems like there is more to stereotype threat than we were first led to believe, and that threatening someone with a group stereotype might actually make them perform better in some situations. Okay, time to end this episode of Sports Science Shorts, lest I threaten you with even more of my rambling. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, my second annual Halloween special. The effect of fear on perception and performance. As always, you can contact me via email, robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights, and find all the information about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
If tears were liquor